Okay, so I guess we'll get started. We have a small group, but people may still be logging in, so that's fine. Again, I'll say, let's see, it's 1 o'clock, so I'll say good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for joining us. This is the ILS 195 online training, and this is the training for part 3 of the ILS 195. I'm Melissa Mackey, as I said, Director of Research here at ILS, and I'm going to be doing some introductory slides about some housekeeping things. And then Caroline Cowpers, who is our Senior Research Associate on the statewide team, is going to take over for the remainder of the training. The first thing I want to point out, as you know, Caroline sent out some materials, and they included, in addition to the finalized ILS 195, information about how to log on this call. Now, if you're on the WebEx but you can't hear us, you can call in. There are two numbers provided there, a toll-free number and a local number if you're in the 518 area code. Then you enter that access code and you'll be able to watch us and hear us through your phone. So if you're having any problems hearing us, then call in. Please mute your line. I think it's set up now for anybody who logs in to mute their line, but if not, make sure you're muted. That's just to make sure we don't have a lot of outside noise going on, interrupting the presentation. The session is being recorded. As those of you who have participated in parts 1 and 2 know, we record all of the sessions, and then one of these sessions that we've recorded for part 3 is going to be uploaded onto our website. Our IT director, Peter Avery, will take care of that. If you're currently having any technology issues, you can call 518-469-1594. That is our IT director, Peter Avery's number, and he can help you if you're having any issues with logging on or with your WebEx. So how can you ask questions? Throughout this presentation, Caroline is going to be taking breaks so that we can field questions. We've built that into the time that we have allotted. So how can you do that? You can unmute your line and ask your question, or if you have a question that comes up while Caroline is presenting, you can go to the chat box. If you look on the upper right corner of the screen, excuse me, you'll see a place where you can go to chat, and then you write your question in the chat box. Just make sure that you send it to everyone. Luchelli Chisunka, who is also on our statewide team, Luchelli, who's also on our statewide team, is monitoring the chat box, and then she'll notify Caroline if you have a question, and Caroline will answer that question, and I'm also available to answer questions. And we have Claire Sartarian, who's one of the attorneys on our statewide team, as our counsel today. So if it's legally related, then Claire will be able to answer it. Data questions, the rest of us can field them. So what's next? I think we got a preview, and there we are. There are pictures, Melissa Mackey, the Director of Research, and there's Caroline Cowpers, who is the Senior Research Associate on the statewide team, as I mentioned. So the ILS 195, an overview. Caroline's going to go over all of these, but just to remind you how we got to where we are now. Part 1 of the ILS 195 that you're now familiar with, that covered staffing and expenditures. We had a training on that in December of 2018, and you actually reported that information for the first time this year. We extended that reporting deadline because New York was on pause. So in, I believe, June or July of this year, you reported that information. And that data you started collecting from January to December of 2019. If you want to see that, you can see that training. If you want to review that training, you can see that video, and those materials are available on the website. Part 2, which we're in the midst of collecting now, in addition to Part 1, we introduced Part 2. That training was in June of 2019, and it will be reported for the first time April 1st of 2021. You've been collecting data since January of this year in the 7 caseload categories, and we recognize that with everything happening with New York pause and the courts closing, et cetera, that it's been a very challenging year. But this is the first time that you'll be reporting these 7 caseload types to us. And then where are we now? We're at Part 3. Part 3 of the ILS 195, for anybody who's read ahead and took a look at the finalized form or looked at it previously, we're talking about case activities and outcomes. We're going to do that training today, and we actually realized this is our midpoint. We've had 4 already, and we have 4 more after this one. So that data will be reported for the first time April 1st of 2022. It's important that we do this training now, though, because you'll start collecting that data on those case activities and outcomes beginning January 1 of 2021. So that's what the ILS 195 looks like. Past trainings and FAQs. If you did participate or you're a new data officer, or you just want a refresher, you can go onto our website at www.ils.ny.gov. you click on annual data reporting, and this is the section that comes up. And then you see it includes all of the data reporting. There's the annual financial report, there's the old UCS 195, and then there's the ILS 195. And then in there, you can get a copy of the form. It's been updated. This is an older screenshot, but just recently we were able to get the new form that was sent to you on Friday is now there in a PDF. We had a suggestion in an earlier training, so Alyssa Clark is going to be working on getting that in a Word document also, so that if you want to print it out or type directly into it before you enter it into Question Pro, you'll be able to do that. We also have the FAQs for parts 1 and part 2. They're at the bottom of the page, the bottom of the web page right there. And the questions that come out of these training sessions that we have will, of course, generate the FAQs for part 3, and we'll be working on those after we've completed all of the trainings. So what to do if you have a question. If you have a question, we know you're going to get a lot of information now. The materials have been provided to you, but if you start going through the form and then you have questions on any of the parts, not just part 3, the best way to reach us is at data@ils.ny.gov. That email address is monitored by a number of us. We have Carline who monitors it, I do also, and Alyssa Clark also monitors that. And so that's the best way to get in touch with us, and then we can email you back. So, and of course, you can reach out to those of you who are on the line and you've called us or emailed us individually before. You can also do that. But data is the best way to do it, and then we can keep track of all of that. So those are the housekeeping things I was going to take care of. And now I can turn it over to Carline, who's going to take you through the rest of the training. So over to you.
All right, Melissa, thank you for the introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Carline Kaupers, and I'm a senior researcher here at ILS. Thank you all for attending this training on part 3 of the ILS 195. Before introducing the part 3 of the ILS 195 to you, I want to make a couple of comments on the earlier parts of the ILS 195. And the first is just a brief, straightforward update to part 1 of the ILS 195. And that basically is all about the staffing numbers. So far, you've been asked to report staffing numbers in the ILS 195, being the attorneys and non-attorneys on staff, as of July 1st of the calendar year. However, as of now, we changed that date to be December 31st of the calendar year. So from now on, you will report those staffing numbers to us, reflecting the number of attorneys and non-attorneys on staff on December 31st of the calendar year. The other update concerns part 2 of the ILS 195, and Melissa already briefly referred to it, the 7 new criminal caseload categories. I will be talking about that in the next couple of minutes, and then after that we get to what the majority of this training is about, part 3 of the ILS 195. We will focus on arraignments, and we will also see how to document what happens during these arraignments in the ILS 195. We will be focusing on closed cases and ask you to report certain characteristics of these closed cases. And finally, I have a brief note on adolescent and juvenile offenders as well. All right, so let's move on to the update on the criminal caseload categories in the ILS 195 Part 2. So a little bit of history on this. So far, the ILS 195 criminal caseload categories were based on the National Advisory Commission's 1973 standards that were slightly revised by ILS. And these standards say that the annual maximum caseload of a public defense office should not exceed 400 non-traffic misdemeanors, 150 felonies, 25 appeals, and then 200 juvenile cases and 200 mental health cases. Now, obviously, we're focusing here on criminal caseload categories, so the ones in bold are the ones that are relevant here. And ILS slightly revised these NAC standards into an annual maximum caseload of 367 weighted cases, so either 367 misdemeanors or 138 felonies or 23 appeals. Now, what is important to note is that these standards have lost credibility over time, and in New York, they have been superseded by the significantly more precise and appropriate ILS caseload standards. And these were announced in a report titled A Determination of Caseload Standards, which was published in December 2016. And in this report, the caseloads are differentiated, or the cases are differentiated by 7 criminal case types. So let's have a look at what these new criminal caseload categories are. Here they are, the 7 types: violent felonies, nonviolent felonies, misdemeanors and violations, post-disposition, parole revocation, and then 2 types of appellate cases, being appeals of verdicts and appeals of guilty pleas. The second column of this table is titled Maximum Annual Assignments. And for institutional providers, these standards apply as an average per staff attorney within the office. So here you see maximum annual assignments within each criminal caseload category that should happen per attorney per year. The IRC column is the minimum average hours. And for assigned counsel programs, the average number of hours per case, the standards say that the average number of hours per case may not go below the specified minimum levels. And in other words, that means that assigned counsel providers are expected to devote on average at least the minimum number of hours set forth by these standards per case. So what does this mean more specifically? If everything went according to plan, data collection using these new 7 criminal caseload categories should have happened as of January 1 this year, January 1, 2020. Obviously, we recognize that 2020 is a very different year due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And there may have been some hiccups in terms of data collection. Also, we recognize, of course, that the data collected over the year 2020 may not be representative of what you would, normally report because of the court closures and all of that. Now, we at ILS, of course, recognize this and we'll take this into account. However, nevertheless, it's important to track this data so that we can kind of like monitor the caseloads over the years, recognizing, of course, that 2020 will be off for the reasons mentioned. So the data collection, if everything went well, should have started as of January 1, 2020, using these new criminal caseload categories. And the actual data that you are currently collecting over the year 2020 should be reported in the ILS 195 that is due April 1st, 2021. All right. So what does this look like in the online version of the ILS 195? As an example, I took question 11 from part 2 of the ILS 195 that asks you to report the total number of new cases opened in the following categories in the last calendar year. Now, in here you see the 7 new criminal caseload categories, starting from violent felonies all the way down to appeals of a verdict. However, you also note that there will be 2 non-criminal caseload categories, being the family court cases and family court appeals. for these two types of case categories, you're also asked to report the number of cases, obviously, when applicable. Now, this question 11 asks you to report the total number of new cases opened. However, subsequent questions in the part 2 of the ILS 195 will ask you for these similar categories, how many cases were closed or how many cases are pending. But it's the same idea. Just to refresh our memories, when to count a new case, when should you count a case as being a new case? Now, obviously, and not surprisingly, when an assignment has been made or when legal advice and or representation has been provided. However, I would also like to note that a case does not necessarily imply the representation of a client from the start, arraignment, all the way to disposition. A case may actually be quite brief in certain circumstances. For example, if representation is provided but a conflict of interest is discovered, or a finding of financial ineligibility is made by the court, or the client, for example, opts to retain counsel privately. Later on, when we talk about part 3 of the ILS 195, I will also explain that there is an opportunity for you to indicate this, what we call partial representation of the case. When to not count a case as a new case? Well, when there was eligibility or conflict screening only, in the absence of assignment or advice and or legal representation. So counting trial cases is about counting violent felonies, nonviolent felonies, and misdemeanors and violations. When you are asked to count the number of cases in these categories, please classify them by top charge. So count them in the category according to the top charge of the case. Regardless of whether it later changed or anything, the initial top charge is what you categorize by. What is good to mention is that violent felonies include any violent felony as defined in Penal Law 70.02 and any Class A felony, except those defined in Article 220 of the Penal Law, which are the Class A drug felonies. Now, for more information on definitions and how to count cases, I would like to note that you should check out the report, A Determination of Caseload Standards. It provides a more detailed discussion of these caseload standards and can be found on the ILS website, there where the ILS 195 materials are stored. As Melissa showed you on one of the previous slides, you go to ils.ny.gov, click on Annual Data Reporting in the left menu, and then you scroll all the way down to the ILS 195 information. That is where you can find this report, A Determination of Caseload Standards. In addition, ILS has also issued guidance on how exactly cases should be counted for reporting in the ILS 195 in the document called Definitions for Reporting Counts of Criminal Cases to the Office of Indigent Legal Services. And I will, in the remainder of this training, refer to that document as the definitions document. The definitions document can also be found on our website, there where the ILS 195 information is stored. So again, go to our website, Annual Data Reporting, and then scroll all the way down to the bottom where the ILS 195 information is. Also there, you can find the ILS 195 Part 2 training, which was a training that was given before this Part 3 training. And that training instructs and discusses in detail how to count and categorize cases. The full recording of this training is available on our website, and if you need a refresher, you can just play this training at any moment in time that is convenient for you. All right, so counting cases with the new 7 criminal caseload categories, we're not only counting trial cases, but also post-disposition cases, parole revocation cases, and appellate cases. And for appellate cases, we distinguish between the appeals of a guilty plea versus the appeals of a verdict. Then the two non-criminal caseload categories, as mentioned before, are the family court cases and the family court appeals. And what I would like to note is that ILS has not issued any definitions for family court or family court appeal cases. So we request you to submit to us the count of new cases as it appears in the provider's record. All right. Having talked about the update to Part 2 of the ILS 195 in terms of these 7 new criminal caseload categories, I think maybe we should pause and see if there's any questions about any of what I presented on so far.
So far, no questions in the chat.
Okay. People should also feel free to unmute themselves and ask their questions if they have any. If not, I will move on to the next and most important part of this training on the ILS 195 Part 3. This is where I get to introduce this new part to you. So let's have a look. As said, we will be focusing on arraignments and documenting what exactly happens during these arraignments in terms of outcomes. We will be counting closed cases and all kinds of characteristics associated with these. And we also will be documenting cases that involve adolescent and juvenile offenders. Now remember, the information that is summarized on this slide does not have to be reported until April 1, 2022. So it's still, over a year away. However, the data on these topics need to be collected as of January 1st, 2021, which is only about 6 or 7 weeks away now. So that's why it's relevant to talk about this today, because as of January 1st, 2021, providers will start collecting data on these characteristics and outcomes listed on the slide. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through these topics step by step. And then after discussing each of these topics, in the last part of this training, I will actually walk you through the online version of the ILS 195. I will walk you through each of the questions in Part 3. You will see on the screen, and I will share that with you, what exactly it looks like and where exactly you document which numbers or what information. So let's have a look at these topics in a little bit more detail. And first, we will focus on counting arraignments. The definition of an arraignment as ILS has formulated it is the following. An arraignment is the first appearance by a person charged with a crime before a judge or magistrate, with the exception of an appearance where no prosecutor appears and no action occurs other than the adjournment of the criminal process and the unconditional release of the person charged. And in that event, arraignment shall mean the person's next appearance before a judge or magistrate. Now, we note that, of course, depending on case assignment procedures, providers may not necessarily provide representation for all arraignments in cases in which they are assigned. So the total number of arraignments that you report here in Part 3 of the ILS 195 may not exactly match the total number of new cases opened in Part 2 of the form that I just showed you before. And this is okay, that happens, and that is more than fine, and we know that that is the case, and we will keep this in mind. For the arraignments that are done by the provider, we ask you to indicate, some characteristics and outcomes. And of course, arraignment outcomes may differ for reasons providers cannot control. However, it is important to track this information so that anomalies can be identified. So let's have a look at what we want to know for each of the arraignments done by the provider. Now, the first thing we would like to know about the arraignments is of of the total number of arraignments, how many was the client in custody for prior to arraignment? Then, for the total number of arraignments done by the provider, we would like to know for how many the client was ROR, for how many the client was released under non-monetary conditions, for how many bail was set, and for how many the client was remanded. And these 4 options all pertain to arraignments of which the cases are going to proceed post-arraignment, and there will actually be future court appearances. The next 3 options pertain to cases that will not proceed post-arraignment because there has been a case disposition. And so for all arraignments done by the provider, again, we ask you to indicate for how many the client received an ACD, for how many the client's case was dismissed, and for how many cases the client or arraignments the client pleaded guilty. All right. Let me see, maybe another pause for some questions. Any specific questions here?
Still no questions in the chat.
It seems that the afternoon sessions are always a little more quiet than the morning.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the post-lunch blues or something.
Yeah. And we're probably just giving very clear information, at least that's what we hope, of course, so that there are no questions. But of course,
Absolutely.
Yeah, of course, questions are more than welcome because we recognize that although we try to provide you with most precise information, sometimes, you know, we overlook some of the nuances that you guys are dealing with. And so if there's anything that we are overlooking or not clear enough on, please bring it to our attention because we actually learn a lot from these trainings and from the questions you ask us as well. So then let's move on to the next topic, counting closed cases. So let me first briefly note what we understand to be closed cases. Cases closed are, not surprisingly, cases where representation has terminated, either because a final disposition was reached in court or for some other reasons, such as the discovery of a conflict of interest or the client opting to change counsel. A case that results in a mistrial is also considered a closed case. And cases closed also include those cases of juvenile offenders and adolescent offenders that are initiated in the criminal youth part, but then later removed to family court. All right, so what do we want to know about these closed cases? We're going to ask you in the ILS 195 a number of things regarding the use of non-attorney professional services in these cases. For trial cases, we would like to know about court dispositions and about the partial representation of these trial cases, if that is applicable. And then we turn to appellate cases. For those, we are also interested in knowing about court dispositions and some of the activities attorneys have performed on these cases. And you can think of things like meeting with a client in person, at least once during representation, et cetera, et cetera. If there's any reasons other than court disposition, we would like to know about those as well. So items regarding that topic are included in part 3 of the ILS 195 as well. Now, in the next few slides, I would like to focus in on each of these topics a little bit more in detail to make clear what it is we're looking for. So the use of non-attorney professional services, according to Executive Law 832(4)(c), providers should have access to and appropriately used investigators, interpreters, and expert witnesses on behalf of clients. Now, ILS tracks the rate at which such services are used, and ILS does not necessarily expect providers to meet specific targets on these numbers, but may just use them to identify any outliers on these metrics. All right, so let's zoom in on these options. Cases should be counted as investigator used when an investigator was assigned, obviously, to a case, And this can happen from either among staff within an office, or the investigator can be retained for an individual case. Now, investigators include persons responsible for assisting defense counsel with factual investigations, including but not limited to identifying and interviewing witnesses and reviewing evidence. We, however, do not consider investigation to include process serving and or screening of clients for financial eligibility. And cases where these services are provided should not be counting among investigator use unless other factual investigation also occurred. Then cases should be counted as expert retained when an expert was retained, whether or not payment was made to the expert. And all cases where experts were retained should be counted, including those where they were retained for consultation only, but did not testify in court. Then, and these are these things that I'm telling you now as to when to count investigators and experts as being used or not used, when to include them, when not. These definitions and these instructions are also given to you in the online version of the ILS 195. I will show you when we walk through that how you can click on it, and then a new window will pop up and give you all the information as well. All right, so then cases should be counted as interpreter retained when an interpreter was retained by the defense to assist with client communication. However, cases involving the use of interpreters provided by courts or persons acting informally as interpreters without being retained, they should not be counted. And then finally, cases should be counted as social worker used when a social worker was used in the case. And again, these social workers may either be assigned to a case from among staff within the office, or they may be retained for an individual case. Right. So then we will go to trial cases, being violent felonies, other felonies, and misdemeanor and violation cases. And we would like to know about the court dispositions there. So these cases could be disposed at trial either because the client is fully acquitted or found guilty of any charge, or because the case was dismissed during trial. They can also be disposed by a guilty plea to a top or to a lesser charge. And other options here are an HBD, or that the case was covered or dismissed in satisfaction of another case, or otherwise dismissed or other court disposition. Then I referred to this before already. There are some circumstances in which cases are not represented all the way from the start at arraignment to disposition. And when that happens, we call that partial representation of trial cases. So for instance, you have the opportunity to indicate at an item in the ILS 195 to say for how many cases the provider only provided counsel at arraignment or only after arraignment. Then we turn to the appellate cases. And for the appellate cases, first of all, we also would like to know about the court disposition. A case should be counted as affirmed if the appellate court affirmed the judgment of the lower court without any changes. It should be counted as reversed or modified if the appellate court reversed the judgment of the lower court or modified it in any way. And cases should be counted as Anders brief filed in case dismissed if a brief was submitted and the case was subsequently dismissed. Should be counted as other disposition if the case was disposed in any other way, such as through dismissal for any reason other than an Anders brief or the case was withdrawn. And then for these appellate cases, we would also like to know about some of the activities attorneys may have performed during these cases. So you will see some items asking about if the counsel met with the client in person at least once during the representation, if an oral argument was made on behalf of the client during the representation, or if the case was moved for permission to appeal to the New York Court of Appeals. All right. So then the next question on the ILS 195 asks you about cases which were closed for reasons other than a court disposition. And options here is that representation may have ended because a conflict of interest was discovered, or a client was found financially ineligible, or there were cases with juvenile or adolescent offenders which were arraigned in the criminal court youth part, but then later removed to family court. And then lastly, representation may have ended prior to case disposition for any other reason. And an example here is that the client may have retained private counsel or any other reason. So having talked about these closed cases and the characteristics, we ask you to report in the ILS 195 on these closed cases. Are there any questions so far?
Still doing a great job, no questions.
Yep, sounds good. Okay, please don't hesitate to ask any questions if you have some, but if not, I'm just going to continue. I wanted to make a brief note about adolescent and juvenile offenders. In part 3 of the ILS 195, there's 2 questions that ask for the number of closed felony cases, one with adolescent offenders who were 16 to 17 years old at the time of the alleged felony offense, and of course, here the client was originally arraigned in the criminal court youth part as an adolescent offender. And then the same goes for juvenile offenders, those 13 to 15 years old. We also would like you to report the number of closed felony cases for those. All right, so I think this is a good moment then to move away from the PowerPoint presentation for a bit and move into the, let me see, the online version of the ILS 195. So what I'm going to do is stop sharing this and then start sharing another screen with you. So here we go. Yes, there it is. So this is what the ILS 195 looks like in the online form. And this is also how it is going to present itself on your screen when you are sent your unique link to fill out the ILS 195 to you by email. So when you receive that email, you can click on your unique link, and that will take you to this online version of the ILS 195. So the ILS 195 Part 3 starts with question 16, which basically just asks if the program provider you're filling this out for is the primary provider of arraignment representation in the county. And question 17 is that question that we talked about the total number of arraignments in criminal cases at which the provider provided representation in the last calendar year. And we ask you to report that for the 3 categories: violent felonies, other felonies, and misdemeanors and violations. Now, first line here, you see that we ask for the total number of arraignments. So there basically you just documents the total number of arraignments for violent felonies, for other felonies, and for misdemeanors and violations. Now, and I'm typing in some numbers here. Those are not real numbers, but I'm just typing some numbers in to show you the functionality of the online survey program at the end. At the end, it will actually give you your responses back, and so that's why I'm filling out some imaginary numbers here to populate some of the fields. Then you've reported the total number of arraignments, and then we would like to know of all of those arraignments in these 3 categories, for how many was the client in custody prior to arraignment. So here you will fill it out for how many violent felonies the client was in custody prior to arraignment. Here you will do the same thing for other felonies, and here you will do the same thing for misdemeanors and violations. And then you see that the other options show up as well that I told you about. The number of arraignments, the total number of arraignments at which the client was ROR'd, was released under non-monetary conditions, et cetera, et cetera. You can report that here for the violent felonies, here for the other felonies, and here for the misdemeanors and violations. Now, I would like to mention to you that if you leave a field blank, that will result in an error message. So, for example, if there were no violent felonies at which the client was ROR'd for your provider, that number would be 0, and we ask you to actually type in a 0 rather than leaving the field blank to avoid that error message from occurring. Another thing I would like to show you is this. So for the majority of the questions in part 3 of the ILS 195, you will see this blue instructions and definitions link. And when you hover the mouse over that link, you will see that you are able to click on it. And when you click on it, this happens. A new screen pops up, and it provides you with all kinds of definitions and instructions that are relevant to that specific question. So here you see, I mean, I mentioned to you before what an arraignment was in terms of like how ILS defines an arraignment. Here you can see that same definition popping up again. And then here you see all these different options and outcomes for these arraignments. And these are also, you know, you get a little bit more instruction for each of these options here as well. All right, so then we move on to the next question. Question 18 asks you to report the number of criminal cases closed in the last calendar year in which any of the following services were provided. So here you are asked to report for all 7 criminal caseload categories, from violent felony all the way down to appeal of a verdict, if an investigator was used, an expert was retained, an interpreter was retained, or a social worker was used. And you do that per category. So here you fill out, for example, that for 5 violent felonies, we used an investigator, etc. And so I'm just typing in some numbers so that we have a little bit to show later on. Now here again, you see the instructions and definitions. So click on it and it will open up a new screen. Well, technically it should open up a new screen. Let me just try that again. There it is. And that new screen then gives you all the instructions and definitions you may need for this specific question. So here again, you see that explanation of what we consider to be closed cases that I mentioned to you earlier. Also, you see that, you know, cases should be counted consistent with the definitions set forth in that definitions document that I referred to a couple of times. And here you actually see that a link to our website, to the definitions document, has been included as well. So that makes it extra easy for you to access this information and to read up on it if necessary and if needed. And then here, moving on, you see for each of the options, investigator used, expert retained, a brief additional instruction of what that means and in what cases you should count a case as such. All right, so then we move on to case dispositions here for the felony, for the trial cases, being the violent felonies, the other felonies, and the misdemeanors and violations. We would like to know whether these cases were disposed at trial and why, et cetera, et cetera. And here again, instructions and definitions are easy to pull up and will help you in filling out the numbers in the most detailed and correct way. So I'm just putting some numbers in here just as a means of example. Then question 20, please report manner of disposition for all appellate cases in this program in the last calendar year. So here we start to turn to appellate cases. So here again, you see those categories that I discussed with you before for the appellate cases. And here you see the two types of appellate cases we distinguish, being defendants' appeals of guilty pleas and defendants' appeals of verdict. Now here you also see a third column titled People's Appeals. And when you pull up the instructions and definitions, it is defined for you right here. So cases should be counted as defendant's appeals when the provider represents a client appealing a judgment of conviction and or sentence, and cases should be counted as people's appeals when the provider represents a client in a case where the people have appealed. And this includes appeals from pretrial orders and appeals from trial or sentencing orders. All right, so again, here I will just put in some information so that I can show you later on how Question Pro takes this information and spits it back out to you. Then question 21, in the last calendar year, in how many closed appellate cases were the following activities performed? And here we ask you about things such as the attorney met with the client in person at least once during representation, made an oral argument, et cetera, et cetera. And here you report that for the two types of appeals. So let me just put that in real quick. And I would like to now bring to your attention question 22. Question 22 is that question where you can provide us with a little bit more information on partial representation of cases. So as mentioned before, representation of cases is not always necessarily from the beginning to the end, from arraignment all the way to disposition. Providers also represent cases for part of the cases, such as cases represented through arraignment only and cases represented only after arraignment. So here you have the opportunity for your trial cases to indicate for each of the categories for how many cases that was the case. All right. And then question 23, reasons other than court disposition. For the 7 criminal caseload categories here, you're able to indicate for how many cases representation ended for each of the categories when the conflict was discovered, when the client was found financially ineligible, and where juvenile or adolescent offenders were removed to family court or any other reason. So again, here you just respond by typing in some numbers, obviously the correct numbers for your program, and then we'll move on to the last part of the ILS 195 Part 3. And here, as I mentioned before, there's 2 questions which ask about clients that were categorized as adolescent offenders and categorized as juvenile offenders. So question 24 asks, in how many felony cases closed in the last calendar year were clients categorized as adolescent offenders, whether or not the case was removed? So here you get to indicate that for violent felonies and for other felonies. Question 25 asks pretty much the same thing, but then for juvenile offenders, whether or not the case was removed. And here we only ask that for violent felonies. And then it has come to almost an end. Question 26 is a question where you can report to us anything else you'd like us to know about the information you submitted in the ILS 195. Please keep in mind this question is optional. So you can use this question to clarify or further detail any answers you've given to any of the ILS 195 questions. However, if you have no additional information to report, you can just skip this and go to the next. Now, when you click the next button, another screen pops up that asks you, are there any documents you would like to share with us in addition to the information you submitted in the ILS 195? If so, you can upload them here. Just simply click the button Browse and then select the document in the folder on your computer. Again, this question is optional, so you can make use of it, but if you don't, that's fine too. And then when you click Next, you will get to the submission page. Now, what is important to know is that you have not submitted the ILS 195 yet. You submit it once you click this button right here. Once you click Done, that is when you officially submit the ILS 195. If you want to review your answers to previous questions, there's a back button here that you can click. And if you are ready to submit the ILS 195, this is where you click Done, and I will do that now. And that is then what takes you to the final screen. And this final screen actually gives back to you all of the responses you gave to each of the questions. Now here you see that it starts with question number 16 because I only walked you through part 3 of the ILS 195 and started filling out answers there. Now, whenever you, of course, fill out the ILS 195, it will include the responses you gave to all parts of the ILS 195 that you filled out at the time. So you will see more responses here. You can easily print these responses by clicking the print button over here, or when you click the print button, there is also an opportunity to say save as PDF, and then you can actually save these responses as a PDF file to retain for your own records. All right, so here you see some of the responses that I filled out all the way down to the last one I filled out. So once you've either printed out your responses or saved your responses as a PDF, you can just simply click it away and you are done submitting the ILS 195. So let me quickly go back to my PowerPoint presentation to wrap things up. There we go. And let me just pull up my last slide. So here we are. Please, if you have any questions, feel free to bring them up during this training, or obviously when you start looking into collecting these data and when you start filling out the ILS 195, additional questions may come up. Now, the best way to contact us is through this email address, data@ils.ny.gov, and multiple people monitor this inbox, so we will get back to you. Sometimes we'll just, email you back, but if you feel that it's easier to talk over the phone, just indicate that, and we're happy, of course, to work with you and to accommodate you. So this is where I would like to invite the audience to ask any questions they may have, and also invite my colleagues in case I glanced over something, forgot something, or if you feel we should provide some more clarifications on some topics, let me know as well.
It seems we had a very quiet afternoon session here. So, and I do think it's very straightforward. I know that a couple of you who are on right now have been in the part 1 and part 2 trainings, and the ILS 195 in its draft form has been on the website for a while. So you're probably familiar with all parts of it by now. And as we said, this will be the first time that you'll report in April on part 2, and then you'll start the data collection for part 1. I'm sorry, for part 3 on January 1st. But we allocated 2 hours for the training just to make sure we had enough time to answer any questions. But since we don't see any questions, we don't want to keep you on any longer than we have to. As Caroline and I have said a couple of times, if you have any additional questions, then you can reach us at data@ils.ny.gov. But other than that, I would just like to thank you so much. All of us at ILS, particularly in the research unit, appreciate all of the effort and your conscientiousness in making sure you complete all of the data requirements, because we wouldn't be able to collect all of this information without all of the providers and their staff and the data officers, et cetera. So we really appreciate that, but we won't hold you any longer. So I will thank all of you. And as I mentioned, we'll send out a notification when everything's available, and the update is on the website of this part 3 training. So Caroline, you did a great job. Thank you, Michele, for monitoring our ghost text box, chat box this time. And everybody at ILS for being on the line. So you guys have a great afternoon, and thank you so much.